Welcome. My name is John Walicki, and I'm going to introduce you to Walicki with Watson and my show today, my first show, although last week I did stream. I'm hoping to do this as a series, and I'm really delighted. I'm not sure if people hear me. Hopefully everyone does. We'll just roll with it. I'm going to take you through an introduction to my developer origin story. And so today I got to dig through a set of boxes. So my office in the basement in New Jersey is 8 by 10, and it's filled with historic artifacts from my career, but that actually tell a story that might be relevant to you because there's been a whole set of inflection points in the computing industry that I'm going to tell my origin story through. What was really fun about writing the blog, which I'm going to introduce you to, Walicki with Watson, on developer.ibm.com, was to think through how... Now, if I were to just tell you the story of John Walicki and how he started with computers, it would be a yawn and you would probably drop off the channel pretty quick. But I'm going to reflect my story through a whole set of epochal transformations that have happened in the computing industry. And I think you'll find it compelling and interesting. And if you've got any sense of computer history, you're going to want to stick around for this because I have so much stuff all within like an arm's reach that I'm going to tell you about. All right, so let's get started because this is just going to be hysterical. And we'll see where it goes with this. Let's go here. So John Walicki, I'm an IBM developer advocate. I've worked for IBM for a long time, and you'll hear that story over the next 60 minutes. But my expertise is in IoT and Edge, Linux, open source, mobile, virtualization, going back as a developer, Java, so many different languages, C, Pascal. I'm going to tell you about that. I was trying to remember all of the languages. But yeah, it's like a dozen. And what's really fun about all of this is there's a story I think you can learn from. But if you want to connect with me today, find me at John Walicki on Twitter or LinkedIn, and let's connect because I think there's relevant developer interactions that we can have. And I'm going to share my expertise with you and the at conferences and workshops here on live stream and webinars. So find me. So I recently published yesterday a blog, and I'm going to narrate this blog, and we're going to keep coming back to this because it tells us an interesting story, at least for me, as I composed it last week. And it's a look back at the computing industry, and it's my developer origin story. It kind of goes back. I'm going to date myself, and I'm not afraid of that. Because I think it's relevant to what's happened over the last 30, 40 years in computing. So where we are today, and we're going to kind of get to where we are today and how this combination of technologies and interests and passion that I have for the computing industry kind of leads up to where we are as a AI, Edge, 5G set of development skills, which I just am, show passionate to share with you. But if you think back, right? So if you think back at all of those, the first time you held a smartphone, you're like, wow, this changes everything. The first time you saw a browser, wow, this changes everything. And so I'm going to tell you a couple of those wow moments for me that were just absolutely outstanding and like eye-opening and just made me be more excited about computing. So let's roll back as far as we can go, at least as far as I can remember. And I purposely picked, the cassette tape. Those who remember the Sony Walkmans of the 80s, you put a cassette tape in, and then when you got the CD Walkman, that was awesome, right? That the first time you didn't have to wind the tape or charge the batteries, and they were big batteries at the time. There was no small, thin devices at the moment. But I'm going to go back to 1982. I was, junior high school, and I convinced my grandmother to buy me an Apple IIe. And my buddy around the corner, Chris Rodell, he had a IBM PC Junior, and we got into it right on like which is better, Apple versus his IBM PC, and we had these debates, and I would go to his house, and we were programming in BASIC, and those of you who remember, we were just fiddling around, and we used some of the graphics libraries, and we were building a graphic of a car. And Chris Rodell here, he starts, and we wanted to draw the hood of the car, and I'm doing the math because I'm a math person, and I want the radius of this curved hood to look really nice, and I'm doing pi r squared stuff, and Chris is changing the value of pi, and I'm like, what the heck? And so it was just different ways to approach the problem. So we had this debate back and forth, and the Apple II was sort of my first introduction into this. And so now I'm going to tell you, so because I've got artifacts. And so I got this Apple II from, and here's the box. Now, it's not the whole box. It's just the outside of the box, because what happened, I'm sure at some point, the box went to the basement, and then the box got stuffed with some things in my parents' basement, and they moved, and the box moved, and the box got crumbled, and it got water damage or whatever, and the box somehow made it back to me in New Jersey, and at some point my wife says, you got to throw away this moldy box, and I'm like, I can't throw away the moldy box because it's awesome. So I cut out just the interesting bits of it, and so it actually has over here the serial number of my first Apple IIe. So I thought that was just an interesting thing. Now, what I remember about this, it was just an eye-opener. I had a class in Smithtown High School West. My teacher at the time, Mr. Landau, just opened my eyes up to computing. And what was really cool about this is it was we learned C. We had like the math department, and so Mr. Landau was in the sort of the tech area, model shop and so forth, which I love to build stuff even today. If not an electrical engineer, I would have been a mechanical engineer. Sort of my whole brain is an engineer. And so over the math department was teaching Pascal. Mr. Kahn was awesome, but Mr. Landau was teaching C, and it was 1980. 82, 83 at this point. And so I found a disc. And so here's the Apple II disc. And it says here Pro DOS. So it was like C. It was the C compiler was on a floppy. And you wind up flipping floppies around. It was awesome. And so I wrote these some awesome programs I remember in C back in 82, 83. Pointers were killing me then, and pointers kill me now, but I've gotten a little bit better at that memory protection, and here we've come all this way. So on the shelf over here is my Carnegie and Ritchie. There's a sort of the forefathers of the C programming language. So if you don't have a copy of this, then you're a C programmer. Find one out, because it's just to go back to the original sources. Here you go. All right, so that was my little story about the Apple computer, and but over time, I had a Zenith IBM PC compatible, and when I went to Lehigh University in '86, and I did a bunch of work. Just I ported some of my really cool C programs to the Apple, to the Zenith and DOS, and this is cool because where is it? When I joined IBM, I got Now this one is you'll just start to drool if you have any sense of history. So this is the DOS manual, and oh, it's not coming through. But I'm going to open this up because it's so cool. So when I open this box here, and I had it when I picked this up when I was at IBM Research, and you turn to the first couple of pages here, and on this second page it says first edition, August 1981, and it's just it gets me goosebumps thinking back on like the origin story of just computing. So when I was at Lehigh, I'm doing a bunch of programming, and so those of you that remember anything about DOS, is it was plagued in Windows, plagued by viruses. And so later in my career, when I joined IBM, I was at IBM Research, and I was part of the IT department, and I was the virus cert for Yorktown and New York. And so at Lehigh, I got infected by the Lehigh virus in 1987, and I've been a virus person for antivirus, a white hat type of guy for a long time. And so I found going through I got boxes. It's so much fun. And I'm just going to rattle off some of these viruses because I saved some of the viruses here on floppies. Who remembers floppies? So this one is W32 Fun Love. That was from 2001. The 1575 1813 virus from 1982. 1992. There's says very cool 92. So I saved some of these viruses. Yankee Doodle from 94. The Green Caterpillar 1575 virus. A bunch of those. The W97 Word 97 macro virus. And then I got some floppies here. The Green Caterpillar, Form virus, Michelangelo virus. Anyone who remembers some of those, there was the Code Red. That was a big one, brought down the internet for a while, and so this whole internet virus propagation was a big deal, and I saved some of them because and what I learned there was that security vulnerabilities are real. And you have to pay attention because I saw the damage that was done early in my career by lax security by programmers. So it's our fault. It's not the user's fault, right? We all blame the users for passing along the viruses, and it wasn't their fault. It was our fault as programmers. We made mistakes, and it's our job to be vigilant and fix them, and prevent the user from putting themselves in a situation where their privacy or their data or their systems are at risk. Because while it was, fun, quote, for some computer hackers to go and wipe my hard drive with the Lehigh virus in 87, I hand edited my hard drive partition and reassembled some of my, I looked partition by partition, track sectors, and I found that the ASCII test and reassembled some of my homework that was due the following weekend. So it wasn't my fault. It was certainly someone else's fault. And over time, I realized it's my job to go and protect everyone else. So that's my little spiel about viruses and security incidents. And so I was, deep into that in the 90s as I helped the IBM research team prevent some of that. Interesting stories if we want to spend a whole long time on that. So after I left the DOS world behind, I joined IBM Research, and I learned OS2, and I'll just rattle some of these off, and then we'll go tell some OS2 stories in a couple of minutes. But OS2 and multiprocessing at the time, Windows 95, single-threaded types of operating systems, and it was really switching. The i386 at the time had this context switching capability. So multi-threading was, call it multi-threading. So then Windows NT and AIX, get some real operating systems going on here, right? AIX, and I was System 390, was it System 390 at the time? So I, got good at VM and some of the mainframe operating systems as well. I should list them here, but it was really about personal computing. And then Windows XP and Win 7 and Win 10 and OS X, and I've got a whole bunch of Mac devices surrounding me. But then over time, it became embedded and mobile, and we've seen this industry just explode with Moore's law and silicon going everywhere. What I learned over through all of this was that there are operating systems and platforms for whatever task that you're doing, and I want you to just put the fanboy arguments aside. And what I learned from my debates way back when I was a kid was, hey, you know what? If it works for you, great. If it works for me, great. Let's work at the open standards level and open interoperability. And I don't care if you pick one operating system and I pick another. I have a preference and you have a preference. But if it helps you do your job and helps me do my job and it reduces the friction, then we really want to let it be. Love them all. Okay. So then in '84, so back in high school, the first Macintosh. Now, as you remember, the first Mac in the commercial that they played at the Super Bowl in 1984. Apple introduced a Mac, and those of you that remember the Mac, it was like this single unit, and you inserted the CD for Mac Paint or Mac Write and Mac OS and Mac Word. And so what I just so happened that there was an Apple reseller right down in Hauppauge on Long Island, and I lived pretty, next town over. And I got this job teaching, someone would walk in and buy this, couple of $1,000 Mac, and they didn't know how to use it, right? What's a mouse? What's graphics, right? We're all like curses based, just type on a keyboard with a green screen. And so I wind up, they give me, this reseller gives me a brand new Mac, and they said, here, go learn how to teach a class. And so I put together a whole syllabus, and for like a year and a half, I ran every couple of weeks, I would teach a Mac Paint or a Mac Write or a bunch of different how to use Mac OS. And it was my first introduction. Here I am in high school, flip the side around, and I'm teaching the classroom, and I put my passion and enthusiasm into that, and that drives through to today. If you ever see me at a workshop, I just bring a whole bunch of enthusiasm for the topic, and it shines all the way back 35, 40 years at this point. All right, so that was my first introduction to Mac and graphics. And so when I saw the GUI for the first time, I was like, wow, this changes everything, right? The whole moving from a command line to now I'm still a command line guy. Let's be totally honest here. But the first time you see a GUI, it was like a wow, this changes everything moment. And it is no going back. Once you see that transformation, it's sort of a hard edge cut, and suddenly you're like, wow, this is going to be really important. And so obviously the Macintosh was really important and the GUI was really important in '84. So then I graduate from Lehigh University with a bachelor's in electrical engineering and really computer science, because there was no computer science department at that point. It was just sort of tucked into the electrical engineering department. And so I get this electrical engineering degree. I was, good student, and I got a job at IBM and several other places, and no regrets. So here I am today. But somehow I get this degree, and I work, I lived in a fraternity house. So just imagine in the 80s what that was like. And it's all brushed by time. It was great. And, but you make mistakes. But I got a degree, and I got a job at IBM. And so I go to work at TJ Watson Research, and I'm doing OS2 programming, and Jerry Cuomo, one of my mentors and my first IBM manager, now an IBM fellow, great leader. So he says, here, John, go write a program that can talk from OS2 to the mainframe and query a bunch of tele personnel data and cram it through the, and remember the mainframe is EBCDIC and the OS2 is ASCII, and so you had to do translation of the data because it was reversed. And so there was something called Sun RPC, and a remote procedure call let you do that conversion. And so they gave me this BSD set of Sun RPC code, and I helped port it. I wrote a program called WattInfo, and it talked to the mainframe call up tele, and it was like the first blue pages, white pages for IBM. And I wrote somewhere I've got a paper about that I published with some of my colleagues at the time. But I wind up, because I was contributing to the Sun RPC, I got introduced to open source. And open source, since that time, has been the most important thing through my career. Eventually, and I dug through this, and it's not like I have this hanging anymore, but I got a plaque. It says 5 years of TCP products from IBM Research, and so sort of my name is scratched in it someplace here. So it was really fun to get that plaque, and it's sort of my TCP programming in the 90s, before that, there was still an internet, and we were able to FTP between machines. We'd use an FTP and Gopher and Finger and SendMail and Usenet. And I had been a Usenet person back in the 80s, and I had a bitnet address. So I was sending email before the sort of the internet, IRC and so forth. And what was I doing there? So we were... And SLIP, who remembers SLIP? So before PPP, there was this protocol called SLIP, and I actually wanted to show you this because I found a modem. This one's actually pretty fast. It's a 14.4 modem, and so I still have the serial cable and the power supply. It's in a box in the corner there. I pulled it out just in case you ever need to test a serial modem. I've got one. And so I wrote this serial port. I actually was like the VPN guy for a while at IBM Research. I worked with Ira Ellis, and Ira gave me access to the modem pool. And I worked with David Bowden at the time, and he said, here's SLIP. And so it's the serial line internet protocol. And it's basically you dialed up and you made a connection and you set your passwords and stuff. So I ported SLIP to OS2 as well. It was all command line stuff. But we were. This is all pre sort of internet, and then in '84 along comes Mosaic, the NCSA Mosaic, and I found an emulator here. I wanted to show you guys, and so there's a Mosaic emulator, and sort of this is what it looked like, and it was like okay, but. Because by this point, I'm now a couple of years into my IBM career, and we're writing Markdown, but it wasn't called Markdown at the point. It was called SGML, and we're writing all our manuals because I did a bunch of products in IBM Research, and we wrote all our documentation and manuals in SGML, and it's Bookmaster, and you published it on the mainframe, and out it came on a 3950. I forget the printer names. And so now instead of having just a command line and text, you could style with bullets and headers. And so I learned HTML, and it was just like a wow moment again. That was just outstanding. And so when you see Mosaic in the first internet browser, and it wasn't running on I'll go back to my little story here. It was running on an RS6000, and it was using OS2 PMX. So it was like sending the X protocol from the RS6000 was the server, and my system was the client. And I'm sorry, got that backwards. My OS2 was the X server, and it was displaying what was being rendered over on RS6000 AIX. And so this, the RS. Now I was doing a bunch with not only was I doing OS2, but I was also involved with MIT Athena. As you remember back, MIT Athena and IBM Research had a big partnership with them, and a lot of researchers were coming out of universities, and they're using, AIX and Unix operating systems. We had a bunch of Sun OS, Sun stations at the time. And what was fun about that is that, again, it was all open source. So AFS was sort of the Andrew file system. Obviously, a lot of Kerberos there, and IRC and Zephyr. So like the first instant messaging of IRC and Zephyr. So, today I kind of chuckle at the whole Snapchat thing because, I was doing that 30 years ago with Zephyrgrams. And I had a bunch of R6000s. I had a R6000 530, and then I had at one point before it was running Power 4. I think it was a R6000 42P before I left research to go on to do other things in my career. But what we learned all through this was that the internet was exploding from a commerce and from a connecting people together. And so now I'm this big OS2 open source person, and we were stuck with IE6 in sort of that early 2000s era. And those of you who remember IE6, it had a really awful implementation of JavaScript and OLE, and Microsoft sort of had a monopoly on the browser market. But I was a Netscape fan, an OS2 person, and obviously by this time in the 2000s, I'm a Linux person. I want to see open standards in HTML and open, W3C sort of win out. And so I later in my career, I led as part of the IBM IT organization an effort to switch IBM from IE6 to Firefox. And it was like the Firefox 3.0, 3.5, and there was never a Firefox 4 because there was a 4 and it went straight to the rapid release cycle, and where are we now? Firefox 80. So every couple of months they release a new version. So I switched IBM in its entirety to open standards based, and there was actually a browser technology center in IBM that was contributing open source code back to Mozilla. And the Firefox team at the time, it was awesome fun to see that grow through 2000s, late 2000s. So let's go, and I'm going to jump forward and jump back a little bit, but then I'm conscious of the time because I got so many more stories to tell. Linux, sort of in the 2000, at the end of the millennium century. A bunch of things are going on, right? So number one, the researchers I got a bunch of CDs here I got to pick up. And the researchers from universities are bringing Sun and Unix into IBM Yorktown, and they want to support Unix. And so some of the folks I'm the manager at the Watson IS department. I'm sort of supporting the research scientists. Remember, I was supporting them for viruses and OS2 LAN server. We built a bunch of LAN server products, and we had a distributed systems management set of techniques both on OS2 LAN server and then also on the Unix side with AFS, and later DCE and DFS, distributed file system and distributed compute environment, all Kerberos based. And so there was this big groundswell for Linux from the researchers. And so I had been an OS2 person for a long time, never really was a Windows 95, Windows 98. And I skipped all those generations. And I went from OS2, and for about a week, I tried to install Windows NT on one of my early ThinkPads, and it was just a disaster. And because I couldn't fix any of the problems, and then I said, scrap this, and I put instead Linux on my laptop. And now it was also crap, but at least I could fix it. And I was compiling, Token Ring kernel drivers, and wireless came later. But Token Ring drivers on my ThinkPad, hibernation and power management has been problematic forever. So what do I got here? So I got in, and I just went through some boxes here, and I'm going to read off. So Turbo Linux, right? Who remembers Turbo Linux? Here's a Red Hat 6.2, so sort of like that's the documentation desk. Here's Red Hat Linux 6.2, not Red Hat RHEL. This is Red Hat Linux 6.2. It still has the shrink wrap. I'm sure I saved this one because it still has the shrink wrap on it. Another artifact. And this one here is Fedora 1.0. It actually was a 3D set, so I got some Fedora here. This is a 3D set of Fedora 1, Fedora Core, Lindos, and I'll tell you a little, and Xandros. And I've got here a Win for Lin, and I've got my Ubuntu disk and a sled. Here's a sled from Novell. This is the Novell one as well. So I've got a bunch of different Linux worlds. And so what you did with Linux at the time, right, since you didn't have Lotus Freelance graphics, you didn't have Microsoft Word or DisplayWrite, there was this thing called Star Office. Who remembers Star Office, right? So I have this is Star Office 6. That was kind of fun. Sorry if that didn't focus. I got another one, Star Office, and then it became Open Office. And so I was a big Open Office person. So IBM worked with Sun and we had a side deal where we got a license to it because it wasn't really full open source. Sun sort of controlled it. And so IBM got access to the source code, and we built a product called Lotus Symphony, which we eventually open sourced to the Apache organization. And then there was a big debacle with when Oracle bought Sun and screwed up the licensing, and today we have LibreOffice. It was unfortunate because I think it was better than open standards wise, better format ODF and the formats instead of OOXML. And so through this, so Linux became huge, and I was the Linux desktop guy. And so I went on to lead the Linux desktop for IBM for quite a many years, like 17 years, from that 99 until like 2015, 2016 when I left IBM IT. And I was this Linux desktop. And you know what, we were breaking down barriers for, around all the different control points that Microsoft was good at throwing in front of us. They controlled the fonts, they controlled the print drivers, they controlled the peripherals and all the drivers around it. And today, you know what, Linux has won many of those battles, right? It's all open, either open source or companies realize that they don't want to build operating systems anymore. And Microsoft has, now changed its tunes, but Microsoft at the time was sort of not in favor of Linux because it was, in Ballmer's word, a cancer. But we continued on, and I led this Linux at IBM. We called it the Open Client Initiative. And we had tens of thousands of Linux, and we still today in IBM have tens of thousands of Linux users. And we were doing, and later in 2012, when the Linux kernel picked up virtualization, KVM, we were able to do desktop virtualization. So I was able to install full virtual machines on top of Linux, and it gave us that containerization. Well, containers came a little bit later, but VMs allowed us to do secure workloads, and we could keep all of those Windows viruses inside of a machine and just shut it down, wipe it out, install a new one if it got infected. And Linux was really good at protecting IBMers. And so we had tens of thousands of Linux users. It was an amazing time through that. So I've been a Linux person and passionate about Linux and open source for all of that time. I was sort of standing at the booth at the IBM booth in 2001 at Linux World, and Sam Palmisano committed IBM to spend $1 billion with the Linux Technology Center. And I was part of that whole initial set of Linux. So John Patrick and Irving Wadowski-Berger kind of commissioned this study, should we invest in Linux? Because we had our own, right? We had AIX, and we didn't want it to steal away from AIX, but it was just too important, and the senior leaders at IBM saw that, Sam Pomazano and others, and so we built the Linux Technology Center, and then there were great leaders in that, Dan and now Todd Moore, leading those initiatives for IBM. And what was interesting was that it's all those that I showed you, SLED and Xandros and Ubuntu and Red Hat. I at one point had to pick, like, which one are we going to standardize the IBM user population on top of, and I chose Red Hat. It had a great corporate, the right mix of business focus and open source ethos that was really strong, and so I chose to deploy Red Hat within IBM, and look how that played out. Many years later, we spent $34 billion, and it's all good. I made the right choice, I think, of that. But you know what? They were excellent choices, and I wound up having great partnerships because I was part of the Linux Foundation. Before the Linux Foundation and Jim Zimler, there was the OSDL, and we had a work group called the Desktop Work Group, and on Linux, and so I brought together a whole bunch of the leading open source desktop people from all the different areas, print and operating systems, and Nad Friedman and Guy Leonardi and others. So I've got a Zimian. Did I show you my Zimian? So I met Nat many years ago. Nat today's the CEO of GitHub, but we used to talk a lot because he was building for IBM Research. We were trying to build and maintain and manage a distributed Linux operating system. We wanted rollback and RPM and deb files, RPM at the time. And so we had this Xandros and Zimian set of tools. It was awesome fun. All right, so I could talk about some stories with others there. But so what happens is, Linux wins. It runs the supercomputers and saves the mainframe, and it runs on the Android phones. The world's got the majority of the Android phones. So it also runs IoT devices, and that's where I'm going with this, because I got tons of IoT devices under a desk. In 20 minutes, I'm going to tell you about. I have to talk about mobile, though, because mobile is super cool. So in 2001, now prior to 2001, I was this manager in Watson IS, and I'm sort of help run the data center. And so we would, be in the data center all the time because I had my distributed systems management tools, and so I had Unix machines, AIX boxes, and OS2 LAN servers and Linux machines, and so I had my StarTech and my mobile, my pager, and I had a Palm Pilot. And those of you who remember Palm Pilots, so this is a WorkPad. This is the IBM version of the WorkPad, and I actually found it, and I have the charger still. I turned it on last night because I'm thinking about today's show. And so those of you who remember graffiti. So what was cool is you had a little stylus, like the styluses that they have for the Apple Pen and the S Pen from Samsung, and so you wrote a set of characters on your WorkPad or your Palm Pilot, and there was a bunch of apps that you could install. It was sort of the early precursor to the App Store, and you could. So this was awesome. It was a note taker and my little calendar, and you could sync it to your calendar for real. So there was a sync program, and you could have your calendar here, and then along comes the first set of smartphones, and this. Now I couldn't find it because I'm sure I gave it to my girls, and they used it as a prop in their little purses because they love to see Dad walk around. So, but I did find the box, and so this is my Kyocera 6035 box, and just so that you know what this looks like, it was a basically a Palm Pilot jammed around a phone, and it was sort of a flip thing, and it was the first set of generations 2G type of thing, and so the box. I have the charger in the box, but unfortunately, did I show you to you upside down? So yeah, there it is. So that's the box. And I saw the box. It came out of one of the bigger boxes, and I'm like, oh, here it is. And it was, unfortunately, when I opened it, not there. I was bummed. All right, so that was the first introduction to mobile, but it exploded, right? So those who remember the Blackberries, so I was a Blackberry, Crackberry addict, and at that point you was good at syncing between your corporate calendar and your, of course, OS2 was, Linux had some trouble, but there were Linux workarounds that you could sync from Linux to your calendar. And so I had a whole bunch of Blackberries, but the only one I could find was and this, those of you who remember, this is a playbook. So BlackBerry, and it's one of its stores. I had a Torch, but this one is called a playbook, and it powers on. It's got a cool little browser, and it runs some BlackBerry apps, and I haven't turned it on in a couple of years, but it's pretty cool. So I had a bunch of different tablet devices, but before I go to tablets, let's talk about phones. Because after the BlackBerry, I had an iPhone 3GS, and sort of that was like a wow moment too, because the BlackBerry and the Kyocera were like this is going somewhere, but then Apple finally brought it all together in the iPhone, and so we had iPods in my house, and we didn't have, and then I got a 3GS, and then it was like, wow, this is change everything moment. I wound up, after the 3GS, I wound up switching to Samsung devices. So this is an S3, so that's my Samsung S3. It's sort of cracked, but I kind of save it and still powers up. And then I had an S6. This is my Samsung S6. That was 4G. That was my first. The S6 was the first 4G device. Then I had a Samsung. I can't afford to get a new one every couple of years, so I skipped generations. So I had a 3 and an S6, and then I had an S8. And I just recently, in my partnership with Samsung, I've got an S20. So I've been doing a bunch of 5G things with my S20. But really, mobile has exploded. I've been writing, mostly Android apps for the last little bit with Android Studio and Java, because I've been a Java programmer forever. But I had a whole bunch of different tablets, and so I have this is a Motorola Zoom. That was a sort of a fun little device at the time. And I've got myself a Tab 7. That's a Tab 7. And I had a bunch of different, this is the first iPad. Those of you remember the first iPads were pretty thick. That one's still in the case. But then I've got myself, my regular iPad, which I use for watching Netflix today. So you wind up having all of these really cool set of apps that you wind up building, and it sort of changed the whole computing industry throughout. So that was 2001 sort of started, and I've been involved with mobile. I built the BYOD policy for IBM IT years ago. All right, so I left IBM Research at some point because they wanted me to go and bring my passion to IBM IT and my Linux skills and open source skills. And I was a very subversive wild duck at IBM IT at the time. And I'm, talking about open standards and Firefox and Linux instead, and Symfony and Open Office instead of some of the Microsoft products. But I went on to be the distributed systems management architect and the workplace of the future architect strategist for IBM IT. And I was involved with Windows and Linux, and we managed lots of Windows XP. I did the Windows XP sunset 2014, moved a lot of 500,000 systems, moved to Win 7 and more Linux at the time. And we introduced Mac. I helped launch the Mac at IBM, both at IBM Research and then later in IBM IT. and I introduced mobile, and we did a lot with Simon Cooper and others, and I mean, not me, but it was like a whole groups of teams, and I managed the teams at the time. I was a manager at leading many of those efforts around Lotus Notes and Lotus Symphony and Lotus Same Time, and a mobile strategy. So I did that for a decade. It was patch management, security management, and we were constantly chasing, keeping the bad guys out of IBM, and very successful in doing that with my global services colleagues throughout the world. But all through it, it was all about open standards and can we introduce more Linux from a security perspective. And then virtualization became really important here too, because we knew virtualization was going to be key to many of the things that were, security wise. All right. So then in 26, so I've been doing that for a decade. I just got burned out by the whole patch management fiascos. And, don't call it for you, but it was more of the same. I had done this for a long time, and the fire drills got tiresome. So the IoT division, IBM introduced and decided they wanted to form an IoT division, and this was at the end of 2015, and within a month, I'm making a couple of phone calls over to the VP for engineering, and I'm like, you have to hire me because I just want to come and bring my passion to IoT devices, because I've been playing with Raspberry Pis for a couple of years prior to that. And so I joined the IoT division, and I'm out talking to developers at this point about IoT devices. And ESP8266s and we had a great partnership with Intel, so we had the Intel. This is one of the Edisons, so that was an Edison, and I've got a bunch of TI parts here. We had a bunch of BeagleBones and BeagleBone Black and BeagleBone Green. With Intel, I had a bunch of Grove kits. Right, we did a lot with Grove kits. I still use some of these Grove kits. And then TI sensors, that's a TI sensor tag. But I was really involved with the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and so this is I've got whole clusters of Raspberry Pis now that I do some of my edge work on. But the Raspberry Pi, really, and so a lot of generations of that. I built this one, was fun. I attached it to a drone one time. That was cool. We put a Raspberry Pi inside of a TJ bot, and so that's sort of the Raspberry Pi with a camera and a servo that waves an arm, and he's got a speaker and a microphone, and he talks to you, and it's all awesome fun. And we made the Raspberry Pi come to life with Watson AI services. We tied it to the IBM cloud, and speech to text, text to speech, language translation. You could talk to it, and lit the LED on his head. And he talked back, and it was a great demo of what you could do with a small little IoT device, collect data and actually tie it to AI services. And so what I have eventually, if you start to play with sensors enough, is you collect lots of data. And so I was working with Node-RED to visualize the data, both in a dashboard, stored in a database, bring it over to Watson Studio, pull it into a Jupyter notebook, and start to do some data science. Now, remember, I'm an electrical engineer, but I hated statistics. And suddenly in the last couple of years, I'm doing all sorts of statistics again, because machine learning is all basically just math. And thank God for libraries, so I don't have to do the math any longer. But I learned a bunch of different Spark and colleagues around me taught me. I get left to learn, because it's going to be the AI. Obviously, machine learning is the future, and you do have to have a sense for how to train statistically significant AI models. And so I wound up doing a whole bunch of really fun AI with Watson Studio, with Jupyter notebooks and data science. All right, so eventually the IoT dev advocates become part of the IBM developer advocacy team, and I've been doing that for the last couple of years, and so it all comes together in now what we're calling edge computing. So edge computing on a Jetson Nano, or I've got a TX2 in the closet behind me. And so the processors, the GPUs, have become powerful enough on the edge so you could start to not, well, yeah, you could train, but what you want to do is collect IoT sensor data from all sorts of things. So maybe an ESP, and it's got some sensors on it, and from this an ESP32. This one happens to be I'm going to tell this longer story about this one, but it's a earthquake sensor. So it's got a really sensitive gyroscope and accelerometer from analog, and we're sending the data to the cloud, and we're searching for earthquakes, and we're going to send alerts out with the OpenEEW community. So really kind of clever. So you build a model in the cloud, and then you deploy the model down to the edge for edge inferencing and prediction. Because you can, as you're streaming this high volume data, you just want to keep it local and just run the model on the local system. That way you're just sending the data. You don't have to send the data all the way to the cloud. Even with 5G, there's just the inferal value of that just degrades very quickly. If you could keep as much of it local as you can, you're starting to do some really cool edge computing scenarios, and there's dozens of them, which I'm deeply involved in, both with worker safety and return to work or with the pandemic, but really important. So edge computing is this combination of moving the workloads closer to where the action is happening. You've got 5G, and I told you about my mobile history, and so now with 5G, yes, better security, lower latency, more secure, lots more channels and bandwidth, but even with the speed, you don't where it breaks down, the bottleneck is in the cloud, right? You don't want to do the edge, all the compute up in the cloud. You want to send the data to the cloud, build a model, and push that model down to the edge, and just keep the local data, the high stream data, and let it stream and keep it on the edge. And so that's what we're doing with the earthquake sensors. That's what we're doing with a bunch of different video streams. So can you do video at the edge and just do object detection with a bunch of TensorFlow? So I'm using the TensorFlow libraries. In addition to doing edge processing, you can start. So this happens to be, and I'm going to talk about some of my other sensors too. So this is a particle electron, and I've got in a closet there a particle argon and boron, and so what I use the particle devices for, because it's got LTE on it. It's a little SIM. It's not like all you could eat unlimited bandwidth. It's like a 5 megabyte plan, and it's pretty simple, low power device, and I can wake up and bleep data to the cloud when I need to. And you can write an Arduino program and flash the Arduino program. So remember, I'm a C programmer forever, so writing Arduino programs is sort of like do that in my sleep. And so I was able to put together the particle and ESP devices, and you start to send data to the cloud, and you can write the data to a blockchain. So I've done a number of IoT asset tracking devices with blockchain, very powerful use case as you track things in the real world. Where are they? What conditions were they exposed to? Temperature, humidity, pressure, vibration. And it could tell you a lot about the condition of the thing that you're tracking. And is it been damaged, right? Is it the medical supplies, have they overheated? Is the food spoiled? And you can learn by putting IoT asset trackers with blockchain, because that that supply chain is pretty long, right? Every from the growers and the producers and the sort of the processing plant and the wholesaler and the distribution networks and then your retail store and then you as a consumer. There's lots of different touch points there. Write all the data to a blockchain, you can kind of track that all the way through from end to end. Really powerful set of stories with that. The other thing that's really interesting here is it's the combination of open source. It's the combination of AI. It's the combination of mobile. It's the combination of IoT and edge processing. So you think through my career, right? I kind of scrolled through all this long history. And so now you learned a little bit about me, and I got all these artifacts. And we're going to come back someday and talk about all of the laptops that I have, because I've got like a dozen historic laptops that I kind of saved along. The IBM ThinkPad Butterfly and many others. Both ThinkPads and MacBooks that I'm looking at, big stack of them that's tall. We'll come back and talk about those some other time. Today was about IoT and Edge and how I got here. But I'm really delighted that I'm going to be able to do a weekly show with you. So hopefully on Tuesday mornings, my time, Eastern, 10 a.m. I'd love for you to tune in. Now, I'm not going to just scroll and share with you a few little blog posts, and we'll dive into some code, because as a developer, that's what I care most about. But I'll do it on Twitch, and I'll do it on YouTube Live and Facebook Live, and we'll do it together. And I love to teach, and I love to write examples. I love to distill the hard problems down to, smaller building blocks and, do this, and then we're going to do this, and we're going to wire it together in some interesting way and, build a TJ bot or introduce you to Node-RED or some Arduino program or edge processing, machine learning, TensorFlow models. And we'll do all of that, and we'll pick stories and projects over time, and we'll see what we get, right? And I'll stop talking about viruses from the 80s. But know that it informs me, right? It's sort of, if you don't know what the bad things are that can happen, it's your blind spots. And if you have those blind spots as a developer, you make mistakes. And what you know, once you experience a security incident or a programming error, you make a programming error when you're doing distributed systems management, and you push that error out to tens of thousands of machines, and they break. It's like a really bad day for you as a developer. Look, I've been there. I've made those mistakes. Now, it's not a good time, because you have to go and send an email to all of, here's how to fix my mistake. You, Mr. User, are now inconvenienced. So know that, just because it's not someone else's problem, it's you as a developers need to focus on, get it right, test, right? I do unit test everything, because when you're doing distributed systems management, you're managing hundreds of thousands of workstations or publishing your code out on, the internet, and lots of people are dependent on it, and you make a mistake, it's, there's real world implications to that, right? Space shuttles don't fly, and things blow up. Fun story. So back in my OS2 LAN era, we had a product called NetDoor. I was one of the developers, and it's the manager that we built this product. It was a distributed systems LAN server product that built OS2, and I was the open door guy. Anyway, so we deployed IBM NetDoor and Core to all of the internal, like 75 IBM sites, one of them being Huntsville down in Alabama. And they were the IBMers that supported the space shuttle operations team. And they wisely locked down their systems the week prior to a shuttle launch. And I, pushed this one time, I pushed a big F up on and it was all distributed, right? So you make a push, and then overnight it propagates to everyone's 60,000 workstations, 70,000 workstations. And the next day, the pager is going off because I make this mistake, and I was worried about the space shuttle. And luckily, everything was fine there because the IBMers were prudent about taking my patches, and they had a unit test cycle as well, and that patch never made it to the controllers on the floor. But it was a big learning moment for me as a developer to test, and it also informed me later on around doing separation of duties, me as a software developer and my DevOps team. So the DevOps pipeline became really important. And so you think back, and all of those lessons that I've learned, I hope to teach you and talk about and tell you the stories, and sort of, they're old now. So, the space shuttle's not flying. It was, but I can tell you the stories that mistakes that I made, and corrections and things that we put in place. So we've better practices, best practices. So I've got lots of those, and I'm going to share with you over the next couple of years. So do follow me on Twitter if you've not already. I've got a few of you. Follow me on developer.ibm.com, and I write tutorials and write articles and newsletters and blogs, and I love to write code and share code there. Very involved with Call for Code and Tech for Good now. Thanks everyone. We're going to sign off here.